everyone. It's great to be here with y'all. I wish we could be in person, but this is the next big thing. We'll be back on campus in September, so hopefully we'll have a chance to meet up then. Um, like I said, like they said, my name is Elena Hood. I'm the director of the Intertribal Resource Center here on campus, and I'm here today with my colleague, my friend, Corinne Hensley-Delfield, and I'll let her introduce herself shortly. We have a presentation that we'd like to share. So even though we've been on Zoom for a year and a half, things get wonky sometimes. So just bear with me while I attempt to share my screen without embarrassing myself. Give me a second here. All right, are we all seeing what I'm seeing? Good, you're not seeing like my home pictures or anything like that? All right, cool. So the title of our presentation or our conversation today is Recognizing Tribal Communities in Higher Education and Whose Land Is This? So we wanted to, or we're grateful to have the opportunity to talk about what it's like to serve Native American students kind of in general, in the field of education, but also specifically at UC San Diego. So there might be some issues or things that you are familiar with, but maybe there's some things that are going to be new for you. And like I was saying just before we got started, we like to kind of keep things as informal as possible and organic. So if there are questions, if you want to put them in the chat or shout them out, we're pretty comfortable with that. And I think somebody's going to be recording, so I don't know if that's already happening, but that's my reminder to Corinne to get that's recorded. All right, awesome, thanks. So I want to start with a little bit of an introduction. As I said, my name is Elena. It's also important that you understand that I am a tribal person myself. On my mother's side, I am absentee Shawnee and Choctaw, which are both tribes that are from Oklahoma. My family on my mother's side came out to California during the federal relocation program, which was an era starting around the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, where Indian families were removed from the reservations and brought into these urban centers. And it had a really deep impact on Indian families. And that's how my Oklahoma side of the family wound up in California. On my father's side, we're from the Palma Band of Luiseño Indians, which is native. This is my homeland. I'm sitting in my homeland right now from Escondido up here in North County. So Palma, the reservation, is about maybe 40 miles northeast of campus. Like I said, up here in beautiful North County, San Diego. And I was born and raised mostly here in North County in my traditional homelands. Moved around a little bit. I went to school at UC Berkeley as an undergrad, which is similar to UC San Diego in some ways in that, the percentage of Native students was very small and it was really important for us to be able to find community there. I did my master's work in education at Harvard University, where the community was even smaller than it was at Berkeley. And time flies. I think it was 2 years ago now that I finished my doctorate degree here at UC San Diego. So I'm also an alumna in education, focusing on tribal students. So that's a little bit about me. And before we get started, I want to ask Corinne to introduce herself as well.
Yeah, so my name is Corinne Hensley-Delfield. I belong to the Catawba people of the Carolinas, but I was born and raised in San Diego. I've completed all of my degrees at San Diego State University, and I've been the coordinator for about 2.5 years now at the ITRC.
All right, thank you. And so one other little note I wanted to make before we really delve in, or it's actually part of the delving in. So in the title of this slide or this presentation, we talked about tribal communities. And I wanted to just take a minute to talk about kind of the language that we use when talking about tribal communities and who that is and what does that mean, because I'm sure you've all heard different terms, different phrases used to identify Native people, whether it's Native American, American Indian. When I was growing up, we referred to ourselves as Indian my whole life. That's how we identified. It actually wasn't until I was applying for college that I actually became familiar with the term Native American. And so at 18, I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess that works. And more recently, I think we've been hearing a lot of the term Indigenous as like this overarching term. But that's a whole separate conversation. We talk about identity, but I wanted to just kind of name that so that in the presentation, you will hear Corinne and I using all of those terms kind of interchangeably. And I always say that, as a Native person, as an Indian person, it's my prerogative to use the terms that I feel are comfortable for me. And so you will hear us interchanging those. If you ever wonder what would be the best term for you to use if you're a non-Native person, my advice, my suggestion to you would be to find out the the specific tribal identity of a person. So for Corinne, she's Catawba. For myself, I'm Shawnee, Choctaw, and Luiseño. So you would want to refer to folks by their specific tribal names first. And then if you don't know that, or you're talking to a group of Native people, the term Native American is an acceptable one in general, you know what I mean, for most settings that you would find yourself in. So I just wanted to kind of name that. So when you hear us going back and forth and is she saying Indian? Like, yes, I am. That's how we refer to ourselves. All right, so getting in, I want to start with a little bit of a pop quiz. It's not going to go on your permanent record or anything, but I want you to think about the area that we are all living, working, studying in here in San Diego County, and think about how many tribes or reservations, I should say, do you think there are in San Diego County? You can think, usually when I'm in a classroom, people start shouting it out, but you can send me psychic messages and I'll take your guesses. So you got a number in your head? You thinking about it? I see maybe some guesses coming in the chat. 7. Yeah, it's more than that. I get guesses for anywhere from, I don't know, 1 or 2 to, I don't know, 100, 102, and so here we are. These are the reservations in San Diego County. There are actually 18 federally recognized reservations in San Diego County. Now, a couple of things that I said there. One is federally recognized. Corinne is also going to talk a little bit about what tribal sovereignty is, but that's just something significant, a language that we use. Federally recognized means that they are, they share a government-to-government relationship with the United States. It's important to note that these reservations, the 18 that we have in San Diego, represent the highest number of reservations in any county in the entire country. So there's no other county in the United States that has as many reservations as San Diego County does. It's also important to note, and you can see here by the map, that those reservations are very tiny. They're very small. And even though the people of this region lived all over, right? We went from the mountains to the desert to the ocean. We occupied all of this and used and lived in relationship with the land all over. These reservations, as you can see, are not the prime real estate right off the coast anymore, right? All of these tribal folks have been moved out into the mountains or into the less desirable places, and they're put on these really small plots of land. But it's important to know that, because even though they're small, it's a significant population. So to have the highest number of any reservations in any county is significant for San Diego and for UC San Diego in particular. And in addition to the 18 federally recognized reservations, San Diego is home to a lot of what we call urban Indians. So before I was talking about my family experience and how we had family that came from Oklahoma to the cities, my family first arrived in Los Angeles, which was a hub, and migrated down to San Diego, which a lot of other families have done too. So in addition to the local tribal people in San Diego County, we have a pretty significant urban Indian population of Native American folks who have come from outside of the region. So this is, in my opinion, this is a population that is often overlooked, or it's easy to overlook because, in comparison to other populations on campus, we just don't stand out as much. You know what I mean? We're not as heard, we're not as visible. And there's pros and cons to that, and that's another conversation that we could get into. But I wanted to just start with this. This is where we're going to jump off the conversation to know that the Indians are here, right? We're here. We've always been here. We're not going anywhere. And it's a population that we need to consider when we talk about programming or the services that we provide at the university. Okay.
All right, so I'll talk about it a little bit. Now that you know whose land UCSD sits on, I'd like to talk a little bit about land acknowledgement. So the ITRC has been working with Kumeyaay community members to create this land acknowledgement. You might have heard this term thrown around before, but I'm going to read it to you. So the UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. So you might be wondering why we make land acknowledgements, and it's because it's important to understand the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. A land acknowledgement is necessary because the university has benefited from these unceded territories, and ignoring that fact continues to deepen the wounds our communities have experienced because of colonization. So this does not heal those wounds, but is an important first step. Now, I don't know where all of you are currently in our virtual world, but there is a really great resource if you're not in San Diego to find out whose land you're on. And we'll put it in the chat, but it's an app. You can actually download it on your phone, and you just put in a location, or you could kind of browse the map and it will tell you whose territory within, it extends beyond even North and South America. I think they even have Australia in there now too, but it's the most complete map that we've found so far to that outlines all these territories. So go ahead and check it out when you have a moment. And feel free to share that resource as well. And then, so we bring it back down to UCSD. So American Indian and Alaska, so if you see AIAN, that's another term, American Indian, Alaska Native. And that's often used in demographics at the university. We only make up about 0.5%. And right now that's like 200-ish students, Elena, a little bit more, yeah. And because we're such a small percentage, that our issues, Native American issues, are often at risk of being overlooked. So it's important that we are included in the dialogue and in this research, and that we are identified in these demographics. And so Elena was talking a little bit more about what federally recognized meant and what sovereignty means. And so sovereign nations are exactly what it kind of sounds like, nations within the United States. So a lot of our tribal nations have been recognized by the federal government as being nations in themselves that have a relationship and their own treaties with the federal government. And that means these nations have the full authority to govern their own people. And so also that means that our position in the ITRC is a little different than maybe some of the other community centers. We're also working with actual governments as well when we're working with different tribes in the area.
All right, so we're going to bring it back down and kind of focus on or talk a little bit about Indian education at this point. So the slide that you're seeing here is a representation of students at the Carlisle Indian School. And the Carlisle Indian School was the first the first recognized federal boarding school that served, I use that term very loosely, generously, served Native American people. And it was started by a man named Richard Pratt. Now, the idea of the Indian boarding school was to bring Indian people away from their homes, away from their families, away from their culture and everything that they'd known, away from their land, and put them all together in a place where they would unlearn their native identity, right? Where they would learn to be, quote unquote, civilized, where they would learn to be enculturated into American culture. And that philosophy behind that was summarized by Richard Pratt's philosophy that the schools were designed to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Now, the reason that I wanted to kind of start this conversation about Indian education with the boarding schools is for a couple of reasons. One, it's important that folks understand that Native American people today, myself included, Corinne included, all of the Native American students at UC San Diego included, all of us carry the weight of this historical trauma in our history, that the boarding schools have not left any Native person unaffected in the impact that they've had on our families, on our cultures, on our language, on our spiritual practice. All of those things have been deeply impacted by the boarding school experience. I talked about how students or kids, children, babies, were kidnapped and forcibly removed from their homes. And when they were taken to the boarding schools, they experienced trauma such as not being allowed to speak their own languages. They were physically abused and beaten for speaking their own languages. They weren't allowed to practice their spiritual or religious practices and beliefs. They were made to cut their hair, which is a significant trauma for many Native cultures who believe that there's a lot of power and strength that comes from the hair, and that for many people, even to this day, they only ever cut their hair during a time of mourning. So if somebody very near and dear to you has passed away, that might be an occasion to cut your hair. But you're being brought into the school system and being made to cut your hair. And it is a trauma, but then you're carrying the weight of that as well. Made to, for abandon your traditional ways of life, your traditional clothing, and adopt white Christian names and white Christian ways of dress. And at the boarding schools, it really wasn't about, critical thinking skills or, reading and writing per se, but it was a lot of manual labor, a lot of time just spent taking care of the school itself, right? So, like I said, we have to start the conversation about Indian education in relationship to the United States, in relationship to even UC San Diego, with this history, because of the impact that it has had on Native American communities. Sorry, and one of the greatest impacts that I see, before I came to UC San Diego, I was working for a tribal school at the Pechanga Indian Reservation. And one of the biggest challenges that I saw there working in a school that was only focused on working with Indian families was the fact that there was this huge distrust of American schools. I mean, all the way from preschool through college and beyond, there was this huge distrust of just the system and the administrators and the teaching styles and the curriculum, and this belief that American schools aren't designed to improve the lives of Indian people, that American schools are designed to take away our culture, to destroy us as people. That's the intent of American schools. And that belief, that feeling was born during this period of federal boarding schools. Right. And so that's something that we carry with us all through this day. So when, we talk, because we could talk, we were talking about demographics and statistics, and, we could have included statistics about the low rate of Native graduation or the low rate of college attendance and, things like that. But I think it's more important to talk about the causes of those kinds of facts, kind of thing. You know what I mean? That even students who are successful all the way through high school and make it into UC San Diego, there is still this piece of them inside that has been carried from, their grandparents or great grandparents. This is not that far removed in our history, that legacy isn't carried in the students that attend our university to this very day. And that mistrust can cause all kinds of problems. You know what I mean? Like it can impact your success in the classroom or your success in your experience at a university. It's not the only thing that impacts it, right? Because there's obviously some good things. We have persevered as Indian people. We have not gone away. We have preserved our cultures and preserved our languages, but the trauma of that experience persists to this day and is something that we work to overcome. And right now we're in a moment where this is actually a lot of emotions, a lot of turmoil is being uncovered today, these very days, because I don't know if you've seen in the news, but recently it kind of started up in Canada where they had discovered, I guess, some unmarked mass graves at the boarding schools up in Canada, which had a similar system to the United States, of Indian children. And I can't impress upon you enough that I am talking about babies, you know what I mean? Children, young children at the boarding schools who died or were killed there, and then just created in a mass grave, unmarked, unnamed, unreturned to their homes, and are just now being uncovered. And that's, like I said, it started in Canada, this recent discovery of the mass graves, but we have the same or a very similar history in the United States. And we have one of our the new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, has just recently ordered an investigation into the boarding schools here in the United States. So we have been finding and will be discovering more of these unmarked mass graves of Indian children and the impact of the boarding school. And that's gonna weigh heavy on all Indian people and have an impact on our education and the state of education. So I kind of just want, I know it's kind of a bleak place to start the conversation, but it's also very real. Like this is our history. This is what we are having to contend with. So we wanted to kind of set that context for you there. Okay.
All right, so we want to provide a little bit of context for what Native students coming into college are experiencing. And then also, it's not just Native students. I mean, I feel like I still experience, or live in these different bullet points here that you're seeing on your screen, as well as a staff member. It doesn't really end. But a lot of the students are living in two worlds. So what that means is, like everybody, school isn't your whole life. You have family, you have friends, you have other responsibilities. But for a lot of Native students, those two worlds that they live in are often in conflict. There are often conflicting responsibilities. For example, in the university, it's often focused on individual achievement, competition, focused on academic, cerebral kind of activities, where they're also coming from their communities, our communities, this expectation to have responsibilities for your community, be in right relation with your community, more about relationships and how to work together as a people instead of all these individual pursuits. And that often it's very difficult to balance those two demands. Also, representation. So we often feel that as an individual, we're not really an individual. When we go into a room, when we're going into a meeting, we're meeting new people, we're not just representing ourselves, we're representing our parents, our grandparents, our cousins, our tribes. And that's a lot of weight to put on a person, especially when that kind of responsibility is completely understood in the same way with the people that they're meeting with other students, with faculty members, with other staff. A stranger in a strange land. So at least for our students who are coming from reservation communities, the university setting might be a completely new setting that they've never experienced before. I did not come from a reservation community. I'm also an urban Indian. So it wasn't uncommon for me to have already experienced this, but it was difficult to go into a classroom and then look out and realize I'm the only Indian here. I'm the one, there's nobody else that I could really relate to in the experience in this classroom. And time as a colonizer. So I think now, post-COVID, or, we're still in COVID, but COVID, I think more people understand this, but the demand to adhere to strict deadlines, timelines, has been kind of counterintuitive to what we've been told how to complete things and how to work through problems. I think now a lot of faculty members have realized that really time, like being able to hit a deadline, isn't really the measure of success in a classroom. But that is something that we often have to contend, and that's a conversation Elena and I often have about not um, that we, that's why we're a little bit organic with our presentations, that we're trying to, decolonize our attitudes towards time. The POC tax is also additional responsibilities and expectations experienced by people of color. Um, for example, in campus involvement, as a spokesperson, all of our students are wearing multiple hats. They're not only responsible for being a student for their own education, but now they're going to be in the Native American Student Alliance. They're going to be the person in their classroom who's going to pop up and speak about their experience as an Indian person. They have a lot of responsibility because they're the only one often that are in the room that has that experience. And this kind of goes into translation exhaustion as well, which you might be familiar with this concept, but it was defined by Dr. Twyla Baker, who's Mandan Hidatsa. She's a president at a tribal college, and she defined it as this: the idea that Indigenous people or other marginalized persons or groups engaging with the larger population on a given subject or topic related to bias must first set the stage in terms of historical context all the way to current day state of affairs before even addressing said topic of bias over and over again due to the lack of education background the listener has. A direct impact or erasure of true Indigenous history beyond the cursory mention in our school system. So what that means is that every time we try to address a particular issue in Indian country, we often have to start from the beginning of colonization, which is kind of what we did with this presentation here. We had to, in order for you to understand the context of where we are right now, we had to explain, well, boarding schools and the history of education with, the federal government and tribal nations, and often having to repeat those histories over and over and over again, just so people can understand where we are right now, is exhausting. And that's not just Indian people. It's, a lot of different groups have to do that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to say, Corinne, too, that I'm sure folks here, I don't know
Yeah.
if you have any Native folks amongst you, but even the non-Native folks I know, well, I guess I don't know because I've only ever been Indian, but I believe, I'm confident that, you have a similar experience that you share. And it, for whatever it's worth, it doesn't end as a student. Here we are, Corinne and I, in our professional lives, and we, at least we get paid to do that now, though, so that's a difference, right. We want to talk a little bit about our Native American student profile. This is specific to UC San Diego, which is, as you have all experienced, kind of its own little world, right? It's not the same as being at one of our local community colleges. It's not the same as being at a tribal college. It's not the same as being at a Cal State University, right? It's its own little entity. So I want to talk a little bit about the students that we work with and have seen at UC San Diego. So the first one is that there's a lot of diversity in our community. We have students who represent tribal nations from all over the country: Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and also some students that have come straight from the reservation. They grew up, that's where they live, and some students that have never set foot on a reservation at all. And they come from these urban communities. And some students that, for whom their Native identity really centers and grounds their existence in the way that they move through the world and through the university. And then we have students who they come to college, and maybe that's the first time that they ever knew or realized or were told that they have this Native ancestry. And so it's kind of a new thing to them that they're learning about, And then we have everything in between. We have students who speak their tribal languages, and students who, don't know one word, and students who practice traditional religious ceremonies and beliefs, and students who are Christian or non-religious. So I just want there's a lot of diversity within our own community. And we at the center, we've tried to make it very clear that we are not the Indian police. So a lot of times we'll meet somebody who comes in and they're like, well, I just found out, or I don't know much about, and there's kind of this hesitation or this nervousness about, presenting themselves to the community because they feel like maybe there's going to be some judgment or they're not going to fit in or something. And, we want to make sure that folks understand that at our center, we take everybody as you come, as you are. And if you're if you're learning or beginning to learn about your heritage, that's exciting. You know what I mean? And we want to be there and help you through that, that process. If you want the help, you know what I mean? And it's a place where you can find community no matter where you are in that, in that stage of your identity development. We have non-traditional students. So we do have some students who, graduated high school and then they came straight to the university at 18. But we also have a lot of students who are a little bit older. We have students who are parents. We have students who are veterans, a lot of transfer students. And in our center, in our community as a whole, we don't do a lot of differentiating between our undergraduates and our graduate students. Because we are so few, all of the programming that we do or the community building that we do is a combined effort. So you've got graduate students who, have 4 kids and a family at home and they're working full time in the same community with students who are 18 years old, first time living on their own, and it's just a completely different experience with some non-traditional students. The connection to place, I know Corinne was talking about this earlier, but we do have students who, for anybody coming to college, that's a brand new experience. Most people are living away from home for the first time, but I want to give you a moment to think about, like, if you've never visited a reservation before, let me try to paint you a picture. When I was a kid, I was living in the Paula Indian Reservation up here in North County. This was, I always say it's BC. We lived in the time of BC, which was before casinos. And at that time, there were no traffic lights. There were no street lights. There was one paved road that went through the reservation, but all the rest were dirt roads. There weren't a lot of, there was a combination of permanent housing structures, but a lot of trailers on the reservation. There was, not always reliable plumbing. I've lived in a time where my grandfather actually had to build us an outhouse when we were, and I'm not that old, but so I'm saying, that this kind of existence, that way of life is not that long ago. You know what I mean? And there are other reservations in the country and in San Diego County too that have even less resources. There are reservations in this country that are really, you can really liken to third world countries with no running water, with no electricity, with no resources, no jobs. And that's not all reservations. I'm not trying to say that that's all, but I think in San Diego, especially, like, if you've never been to a reservation, I think that the idea of a reservation for most of us in this area is related to the idea of a casino and like this big resort and big fancy houses and things like that. But you need to know that that is really abnormal. You know what I mean? That is really out of the ordinary. And so imagine coming from, the experience that I described and then coming to this university. Yeah, it's a new experience for everybody, but it is like being on another planet. You know what I mean? To come from a reservation and come to a university like UC San Diego. So we try to be aware and cognizant of that experience for our students. And then we talk about the different cultural practices that might not be even allowed, I guess, at the university. So for example, one of the things that we think about is we like to start, you started today's, our time together with a moment of silence, which we really appreciate. I think that's a beautiful way to begin. For us, one of the ways that we begin our gatherings, it doesn't even have to be like a deep ceremonial thing, but just our gatherings when we spend time together is with a prayer. We open with a prayer, and often that prayer includes the burning of sage, which is kind of a cleansing agent for everyone, right? But you can't be in the dorm and burning your sage, you know what I mean? So we have to think about those like accommodations or those limitations for our Native students to be able to engage in their traditional cultural practices. That's something we need to be aware of and thinking of. And then I'm going to talk about the center, the Intertribal Resource Center, kind of our philosophical approach to addressing all of these things that we have been discussing. So we really want to take a family-centered approach. You know, our idea is that education involves the entire family. As Corinne was saying before, like we don't show up just as individuals. We show up as our parents and our grandparents and our extended families, right? So all the types of programming or engagement that we try to do through the center is not only focused on the student themselves, but also their extended family or their chosen family, whoever it is that they choose to bring through our programs and whatnot. We also are focused on student support services. So at the, at the end of the day, the center is there to support our students and their success at the university. We want them to graduate. We want them to have positive experiences. And so our number one priority is to focus on the students. And we also operate with this belief that there are multiple pathways to college. So part of our work is, we want to increase that 0.5%. We want to enroll, encourage more Native students at UC San Diego. So we do that through early outreach. We have a program where we start with 4th grade tribal students and we introduce them to the world of college. But we also recognize that many of our students are going to be transfer students or even reentry students. When I was an undergraduate, we had a student who was a grandpa. He was like 65 years old and he returned to college and he was running around with a bunch of us 18-year-olds and we were like anti-Columbus Day things, chalking up Save Their Sidewalk. And he was out there with us with his cane and stuff. And, so we always try to recognize that there is no one way to enter or go through college. And so we try to make sure that all of our community members know that there's always a way in, right? I'm a big fan of just those multiple pathways. And then community engagement. We want to be a place for our entire tribal communities in the region, not just for our students. Like I said, I grew up here in North County, and I remember that every year, San Diego State, SDSU, they held a powwow, or Palomar College, they had a lot of programs for Native people. And as a kid, just in the area, I remember going to these universities, and that was just kind of almost like a hangout place. You know what I mean? It was a place where you can go and you're going to see a bunch of other Indian people. And we want to be, we have and are beginning and continuing to create that type of an environment at UC San Diego. We have our annual powwow in May, which you're all invited to. It's the 3rd Saturday of May every year. And then we have in November, we do our Native American Heritage Month, where we do a bunch of different events. Again, you're all invited to come out to those as well. So we want to be a place that's a resource and a home away from home for our students, but also a home that our student or our community from the region can come and engage in.
All right, and so to support that philosophical approach, there's a few things that we try and focus on when creating community on campus. One is supportive relationships that take into account students' cultural backgrounds and the integration of students' cultural identities positively relates to successful degree completion. And the desire to connect with other Native students, faculty, and staff on campus. You feel much more engaged on campus in your classrooms when you have other folks that understand your particular experience. And I think that's true for absolutely every single student. And so that's what we're trying to do for our Native American students. And then maintaining connections to home. That leads to students being able to serve as mentors to future generations. And that's often, we've already touched on that concept a few times before, but this is a lot of our students, and myself, Elena as well, we really value this idea of bringing our skills to our communities, being good community members, being in right relation with our community. And so often we do have programs that kind of that will bridge that gap, allow students and community members to work together on certain projects or programs. Like the powwow is an excellent opportunity. So there's there's many students who, even though they're Native American, never been to a powwow before, don't really know anything about it, but we give them the opportunity to learn how to run one, all the aspects to it, introduce them to the community members who run these powwows in the community, locally and across the nation as well. And then we can go to the next slide. And so then what you could do to support Native American students, or what other faculty and staff can do as well, supporting the ITRC, is participate in our programs. So yes, please do come to our powwow. Our students do put a lot of work into it. It's a lot of fun. We also look for volunteers as well for that, as for the powwow. And then we also have Native American Heritage Month, which is all of November, whole bunch of different programs, big and small, that we have for that month. And then also share information about ITRC activities. You can learn about our different programs and activities by following us on our social media and also signing up for our newsletter. There's plenty of programs that you're welcome to join as well. It's not just for Indian students or faculty and staff. We have a really great one that was actually started by one of our graduate students, our language and culture table. And that's where different students volunteer for the month for for an hour to talk about some particular aspect of their tribal culture, be it stories, be it language, be it a traditional art form. So in the past, we've had one of our students demonstrate Navajo rug weaving. We've had a lot of our students give little language lessons, and those are things that you can attend and enjoy as well. So we'll also share all these links in the chat, but that's a good way, and definitely sign up for a newsletter. That's like our main way that we get out all of our information for all the upcoming events. And that's once a month.
Yeah, more or less once a month.
More or less.
It's just the two of us in the center cell sometimes. My time is a colonizer, so don't expect it on the first of every month. Yeah, so those are the ways to connect with us that Corinne was mentioning. So we'll leave that up there if you're interested. And in September, like I said, we'll be back in the center. We are located on the second floor of Price Center West, right down the hall from Spaces. If you know where that is, or right on top of Rubio's, everyone knows where that is. So, you're welcome to come by and visit us in September when we're back. And we have our email addresses there. So if there's anything that you have any questions or concerns or complaints about, you can send us an email there, and we'd love to connect. So hopefully I think one of the challenges with doing a presentation like this is like, there is so much that Corinne and I want to say. There's so much historical context that we want to set up. There's so much about what's happening today and thinking about the future. So we try to, do as much of a comprehensive, in a nutshell, view as we could. So hopefully that's giving you a little bit of insight into our tribal communities, both just in terms of education as a whole, but also specifically here at UC San Diego. Yeah, and we have a few minutes, so I don't know if y'all want to wrap up, or if you have any questions, or like I said, we're interested in conversation and dialogue. So yeah, but that's all we have for you.
Well, thank you so much. We truly appreciate y'all taking the time out to spend with us today, and be a part of our training, which is really important. If y'all have any questions that you would like to ask directly right now, feel free to ask them or to put them into the chat. So we'll give it a few minutes for that, to see if some folks would like to do so.
And if there aren't any questions right now, that's okay too.
Doesn't seem like there are any questions right now, but we'll definitely go through and save the contact info. But if everybody can do a little emoji clap, or, a real-time clap or snap for the presentation, that would also be very welcome. But thank you once again. And as far as the recording goes, since it is a little bit of